Hello and welcome to the second half of Chapter 14, Later Homo. So the descendants of Homo erectus varied and can be confusing to sort out and are often just referred to as later Homo. They can be broken into three general groups: archaic Homo sapiens or transitional forms or early archaics. Then the second group is the Neanderthals or later archaics, and the third group is the anatomically modern humans. Although Homo erectus made it from Africa to Asia soon after they evolved, it took them a lot longer to get to Europe. So the earliest known European is from about 800,000 years ago. There's two sites in Spain that they found these guys at. The discoverers believed that they are more modern and distinct enough to be from Homo erectus to be called their own species, which they named Homo antecessor. And they're proposed as the common ancestor for Neanderthals and modern humans, but there's still a lot of controversy over whether they are a separate species or not. Around 600,000 years ago, you start to see more fossil humans in the archaeological record, and they become more numerous around 400,000 years ago. The archaic or Homo sapiens or transitional forms lived until about 125,000 years ago over much of Europe and Asia as well as Africa. They're anatomically and behaviorally, they exhibit a mix of Homo erectus and modern Homo sapien traits, but the fossils show considerable variation and a lack of a suite of distinguishing features. So when we've talked before about how you'll have a suite of features that you can say distinguishes Australopithecus afarensis from Australopithecus africanus, or a suite of features that distinguish Homo habilis from Homo erectus. But these guys don't have a suite of features that distinguish them as a specific species. We just know that they are different from Homo erectus and haven't quite reached modern Homo sapiens. So some paleontologists prefer to use a specific scientific name for some of the remains rather than just referring to them as early archaic humans, and they call them most commonly Homo heidelbergensis for those found in Africa and Europe, and those from Asia they call pre-modern Homo sapiens. So there's a lot of guesswork going on. Some other people prefer to just call them archaic Homo sapiens. There's a lot of confusion about whether they're related to each other, whether they're one species, multiple species, and if they're multiple species, which ones gave rise to modern Homo sapiens. And recently, they did find some DNA in a specimen from around 400,000 years ago they were able to analyze. It's the oldest DNA that's ever been analyzed, and that didn't resolve any of the questions. So we still don't know for sure who led to who at this point. On 389, there's a general list of relative to Homo erectus how they differ. So we're seeing a larger cranial capacity, a decrease in the post-orbital constriction, again that's the constriction and the bone right behind the eyes, a higher skull that is shorter front to back, a more rounded occipital area, a more rounded forehead, and smaller teeth and jaws. Relative to modern humans, they still have a heavier face, larger teeth, the skulls are longer and lower than modern humans, a large supraorbital ridge, that's the brow ridge that goes across here, that's often not continuous, but has one over one eye, a divot, and then one over the other eye. Archaic Homo sapiens were more culturally diverse than Homo erectus. They had more varied tools than you see with Homo erectus. We start to see the existence of primitive shelters during this time period and more efficient hunting techniques. At the beginning of the early archaics, they're still using the Acheulean tools that we saw previously, which are these big hand axes that have been worked on both sides but are pretty crude and large. Later, in the early archaics, they added new tool-making techniques, the most important of which was the level Wassian flake tools. So when you had the Acheulean tools, they were just taking a rock, a core, and flaking it until it turned into a shape. They weren't using the flakes that came off. They were just using the large shape that they created. With the Lavoisian tool technique, they were taking a core and specifically working it so they could take off flakes. And these flakes, they learned how to work the core in such a way that they could take off very uniform size and shape flakes. And these then could be made into knives, into points. This is when we start to see them hafting these onto shafts so that you have spears during this time period. They start making spears. So this was a big advance in tool technology, the Lavoisian flake tools. Then about 150,000 years ago, we start to see Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans turning up. So where were these turning up? So the Neanderthals were the first ones discovered, and they were discovered in Europe. In 1856, bones were found in a limestone quarry near Dusseldorf, Germany, in the Neander Valley. Neanderthal means Neander Valley. Tal means valley. And they were found by workers at the quarry who thought they'd found bare bones. So they took them to the local science teacher at the high school and said, look what we found. And the science teacher looked at them and goes, those are not bare bones, and took them to the university to the anatomy professor and showed them to him. And working together, the two of them then published their findings a year later, saying we have found, early primitive humans or humanoids. Neanderthals existed in Europe and the Middle East, and they lasted from, 150,000 years ago till about 30,000 years ago. The most distinctive specimens are those that were first appeared around 75,000 years ago in Europe. This is the height of the Pleistocene Ice Age. This is a hominid that is evolving to deal with a very icy universe. So they were living along the edge of the ice flows, hunting large game. They frequently did inhabit caves. This is where the idea of the caveman came, because many of them have been found in caves there. And they lived in caves because caves provided shelter shelter from predators, shelter from the weather. Caves, if you ever have been in caves, you'll find that cave systems tend to have a very uniform temperature once you get far enough into them below ground. So they could have kept them warmer during the Ice Age. So they were very efficient big game hunters. So they were using their tools to hunt large game. Because they were hunting so much during this time period, we see another advance in their tool culture. As we get closer and closer to modern humans, the tool culture keeps advancing. So they have more complex and varied tools, and this sophisticated flake tool technology using the Lavoisian flake tool technology is called the Mousterian tool culture. And so what we have is they had very finely done axes. So compare this and how finely flaked this is and how even it is compared to the Acheulean. So they also were making larger tools that were used for hammers and breaking things open. They also were making awls. So this is an awl, so the point would be used to drill a hole in wood or bone or leather, depending on what they were making. So a lot of difference in more tools than you saw with the Acheuleans. We also know they had a very rich cultural life. So with the Neanderthals, we see the first time we see portable art. They were carving art. They would take bone and carve drawings onto bone. They would also carve figures in bone. And we're seeing the first human burials, deliberate human burials. So they were buried with grave goods, often with evidence of rituals such as specific body positions, or they have found ones that were buried with flowers across them that they can tell because of the pollen in the dirt, in the soil around the body, or a number of them where they were covered, the body was covered with hematite, that as the body decomposed, the hematite got onto the bones and stained the bones. It had been applied to the body before burial. We also have with the Neanderthals evidence of spoken language. Their language centers of their brain were the same size and shape as ours. And their hyoid bone, which is that bone, remember, in your throat that's attached to your tongue and your larynx, their hyoid bone was the same size and shape as ours. We also see evidence of a strong social support network with Neanderthals, where we have a number of different fossils that have been found with evidence of healed fractures, especially one that was found with a healed leg fracture. So if you've got a fractured leg, you're not going to be able to take care of yourself at all. You can't get up on it. You can't go hunting. You can't get food. They had a social support network that helped them to live through that until the bone healed. On page 390 of your book, there is a list of Neanderthal features relative to modern humans. So here is a Neanderthal skull. We have a long, low skull. They don't have much of a forehead, but it's very long front to back. They actually have a large cranial capacity. It's increased again. Homo erectus was 850 to 1100 cc's. These guys averaged around 1520 cc's, so slightly larger actually than modern humans. They had the maximum breadth is not all the way down here as it was with Homo erectus. It's about midway, so it's around here is the maximum breadth. They have what's called an occipital bun. It's hard to see on this one because a lot of the bone's missing. As you can see, the gray parts where it's bone's missing. But basically, they had an outpooching of the skull right at the occipital area, at the occipital suture. They still have a very large supraorbital ridge. They still have fairly large brow ridges. They've lost most of their postorbital constriction. They have very rounded orbits compared to modern humans, and what's called midfacial prognathism. So they had kind of a puffy midface. So you can see right here, it's kind of puffy. This is the maxillary sinus area. So they had an enlarged maxillary sinuses. Their zygomatic arches are more swept back than a modern human's. Ours are very much across and then back, and theirs are more of that swept back look. Very broad nasal aperture. The opening for the nose is very, very large. And they had what's called a retromolar space. So this example here has all three of their molars, but there's still a gap back here. So this is the retromolar space. So they had a gap between their third molar and the upper part of their jawbone that we don't see in modern humans. They did not have a mental eminence. Their jaw was vertical, and they had very massive limbs, shorter than modern humans with much more massive limbs. Several of these features they feel are related to them living in such a cold environment, the adaptations to a cold environment. So the shorter appendages, the stocky build gives less surface area for heat loss because you're going to have less skin. Skin's the largest organ in your body. And if you're short and stocky, you have less skin. So therefore, you're going to lose less heat. The large nose and sinuses, they feel, was to allow the air to come in and circulate into those sinuses to warm up and to moisturize before going down into the lungs. If you've ever gone up skiing or up to the snow, that really cold air, it's very dry and it can be very sharp feeling when you breathe it in. So they had they had this whole system through their face to warm and moisturize the air coming in. They feel the rounded orbits may have left the eye less exposed to the cold, and the slightly larger brain, the arterial circulation of the larger brain would have helped to keep it warm. Rather than being more intelligent, it was adaptation to keeping the brain warm enough in the cold environment. Then we have anatomically modern humans. So Neanderthals evolved in Europe. Anatomically modern humans did not. We evolved in Africa and then moved into Europe. So we first appeared in Africa more than 150,000 years ago and didn't reach Europe until about 35,000 years ago. So Neanderthals were on their own in Europe for all that time before anatomically modern humans turned up. The dates that anatomically modern humans arrived in Asia are a little less clear. They're estimated to be sometime between 40 and 25,000 years ago. The earliest examples of our species arose in East Africa and South Africa, we have seen as the case with previous hominids. So Ethiopia and Tanzania and South Africa. The earliest known fossil from Ethiopia dates between 154 and 160,000 years ago. By 100,000 years ago, they had migrated back out of Africa as far as Israel, but they didn't make it to Europe until about 35,000 years ago. The best known of the European anatomically modern humans is Cro-Magnon, or Cro-Magnon, because it's a French word. They're anatomically modern. You can see the skull looks very much like a modern human. Nice forehead, taller, shorter front to back. The widest part is high up on the parietals. So very much we have no prognathism in the face, nice vertical face. Again, as they evolved new tools. Theirs are called the Upper Paleolithic tools. So this is like the most advanced tools of the Stone Age. Their tool technologies are Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, Magdalenian, and Perigordian. And as they were evolving these new tool cultures, they were evolving new inventions, new types of tools. One is the addle-addle. The addle-addle was used to throw spears better. It gave you a better reach and your spear could go farther. Javelins, harpoons, clubs, stone missiles. So they were using slings to throw stone, where they were shaping rocks to be nice and round so you could throw them with your sling. Boomerangs, bolas. Bolas are a string, probably of leather, with stones at either end, and you swirl it around and throw it, and you can use it to catch birds. It'll wrap around the birds' wings or legs, or small animals. You can throw it and wrap it around their legs, and they can't run. And burins, which is a type of woodworking tool. So we know that they were working with wood to make, and we know that they were making tools out of bone and wood and antlers during this time period. Things such as awls, needles, pins, other types of fasteners, and fish hooks. Anatomically modern humans were taller and more slender than Neanderthals. They appeared to live in larger groups and have a more varied set of cultural adaptations. So on page 391, you have a list of how Homo sapiens sapien compared to Neanderthals. So we have the shorter, higher skull. It's not long and low, short and high. The cranial capacity was 1,200 to 1,700 cc's with a 1,325 average. So the average is a little bit lower than Neanderthals, but again, they think that the Neanderthals had the larger sized brain to have more arterial circulation to keep their brains warm. More vertical forehead, so we're getting that vertical forehead like we have. A much smaller supraorbital ridge, so they still have a bit of a brow ridge at this time period, but nothing compared to Neanderthals. Maximum breadth high on the parietals, more angular orbits, so the orbits are much more rectangular. See the angles compared to our Neanderthal friend, where he had very rounded, there's not really much angularity in there. More squared off zygomatic arches, so instead of sweeping back, the zygomatics go across and then back. Much narrower nasal aperture than the Neanderthals. smaller teeth and jaws, a more slightly built skeleton, not as stocky but taller, and a mental. I don't have a Homo sapien jawbone, but we finally have the mental eminence, the development of the chin. So when anatomically modern humans moved into Europe from Africa, Neanderthals had already been there for about 100,000 years. They overlapped for a few thousand years before Neanderthals then disappeared from the landscape. Originally, when people were studying Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, they felt that the Neanderthals were a side branch, much like the robust Australopithecines were a side branch to the gracile Australopithecines. The Neanderthals were a side branch that died out, and they weren't in our line of existence. If that was the case, then their name would be Homo neanderthalensis. They'd be their own species. Other researchers felt that some Neanderthal traits were present in modern humans due to interbreeding, and that would make them distinct only in the subspecies level, and then they would be Homo sapien neanderthalensis. But it wasn't until we reached modern DNA studies that we were able to discover the truth. So the first study of mitochondrial DNA that was taken from a humerus showed that this split between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals occurred about 550 to 690,000 years ago, too far back for there to be a shared gene pool. So they split when the Neanderthals first left to come to Europe, or back farther. But we've now through genetic studies, we have the entire human genome has been mapped, and the entire Neanderthal genome has been mapped. And this is because Neanderthals are recent enough that they're not completely fossilized. So they are able to get DNA sometimes from their long bones or from inside their teeth, especially their molars. And so they have mapped the Neanderthal DNA, and they have mapped the human DNA, and it has shown that there is, in Europeans of European or Asian descent, up to 3.5% of their DNA is actually from Neanderthals. So there was crossbreeding going on, which means that Neanderthals are now known as Homo sapien neanderthalensis. They are a subspecies. They didn't go completely extinct. Some of their genes live on in us today. So the question is, what happened to Neanderthals? Why don't we have them anymore? Just a few thousand years after anatomically modern Homo sapiens made it to Europe, the Neanderthals disappeared. It's now felt that it was probably a combination of things that killed them off. We out-competitioned them because we had better tools than they did. We outbred them. Homo sapiens seems to have had a more rapid reproduction rate than Neanderthal, and the interbreeding. All of these things, and possibly because because the climate was warming up and they weren't adapted to a warmer climate like we were. All of these things together probably led to their extinction. We'll never know for sure exactly why they went extinct, but they went extinct except for the genes that live on in us today. We now know that Homo sapien sapien and Homo sapien neanderthalensis are not the only hominids from this time period. We have found others. One is Homo floresiensis. This one was found in 2004 and has been nicknamed the Hobbit. This is the skull of an adult. You can see the size difference. The fossils were found in Indonesia, and they found as many as 13 individuals in a cave that they averaged about 3.5 feet tall. This was the Lingboa cave on the island of Flores. They found fossils and stone tools and that dated from between 13,000 and 94,000 years ago. So there was a whole span of time. Many feel that they represent a new species that we haven't discovered before. early objectors to this idea felt that instead that they were, that especially the early, when they were first described, they only talked about one, that it was an individual that had microcephaly or Down syndrome, some type of medical condition that would have led to having a small brain and a shorter than normal body, because these guys were only 3.5 feet tall. And they had a tiny brain of only about 380 cc's. Some researchers feel that because their unusual mix of features can be explained by being an isolated population on an island. So we have, besides being an isolated population that had limited, they only had limited genes available to them, the one thing we find on islands is called island dwarfing, where creatures living on an island with limited resources tend to become smaller over time, because then they can, though the smaller ones don't need as many resources. So this island also had pygmy elephants. And the reason there was pygmy elephants is because elephants had gotten over there, but there's not, limited resources, so the smaller elephants survived better than the big elephants. So island dwarfing combined with genetic drift and natural selection. Then some researchers feel that instead these are descendants of an early migration of Homo erectus out of Africa. And then still others feel that this is an early migration of Homo habilis out of Africa. All we know for sure is that the tools that are found on Flores date back as far as 800,000 years ago. And while they were originally attributed to Homo erectus, they've also been found with Homo floresiensis, even though their brain capacity was so small. The kind of fun, interesting little thing about these guys is there is a local legend on Flores that's been passed down through generations, and it predates the finding of these fossils, about small, long-armed, hairy, cave-dwelling creatures that lived on a nearby active volcano. People referred to them as Ebu Gogo, or the grandmother who eats everything, and they were known for their voracious appetites. And they lived near the active volcano. And this story predates finding these guys who, as far as they can tell, were killed by a volcanic eruption and were tiny and had longer arms related to their legs than we see with modern humans. So we just don't know. But we do know because of that story, they probably overlapped with modern humans on the island. So they're probably not a direct ancestor, but a side shoot. The most recent hominid from this time period that's been discovered, I don't have a cast to show you, are the Denisovans. The Denisovans were first discovered in 2010 in the Denisova cave in southern Siberia. It's an area that's been inhabited over time by both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens sapien at different times. They managed to extract mitochondrial DNA from them, and the analysis showed that the fossils were neither Neanderthal nor modern humans. So they've now been able to sequence their genome, and they've discovered that 3 to 5% of the DNA of people from Melanesia and of Australian Aborigines contain Denisovan DNA. So again, this would be Homo sapien denisovan. They'd be a subspecies that we obviously interbred with at some point in time. Current DNA research indicates a spread of at least 60,000 years between all the Denisovan fossils that have been found, with considerable genetic variation, and they're hoping to find more. That's all that they know at this time. So that's the end of chapter 14. That's the end of our book. You'll have homework, and then next week I will open up the last midterm, which will again be like all the other midterms, and have a good rest of your semester.